Go ahead, the teen said, flicking invisible dust off his sleeve, his voice loud enough to echo across the marble lobby. That's what you're paid for, right? The words hung in the air a second too long, sharp and careless, as if they had weight. Then came the sound, soft, almost insignificant, a quick flick, a drop landing against polished leather. Marcus Reed didn't move. Not when the faint mark spread across the surface of his black shoe. Not when a few nearby employees turned their heads. Not even when the receptionist's typing slowed to a stop. The entire lobby seemed to tighten, like a held breath stretching past comfort. Floor-to-ceiling glass panels reflected everything in fragments. Tailored suits, glossy floors, the city skyline 30 stories below, and in the middle of it all stood Marcus, still as part of the architecture itself. He had been standing there for exactly 12 minutes, hands folded in front of him, posture straight but unassuming, the kind of presence people learn to look through rather than at. A driver. That's what they saw. A uniform. A role. Something functional, forgettable. Ethan Calloway shifted his weight, rolling his shoulders like the space belonged to him, because in every way that mattered to him, it did. At 18, he wore confidence the way others wore cologne. Thick, noticeable, impossible to ignore. His watch gleamed under the chandelier light. Custom, expensive, a gift he hadn't earned but carried like proof of something. Well, Ethan added, tilting his head slightly, waiting for a reaction that didn't come. Marcus's gaze remained steady, not fixed on the boy, not lowered either, just level. There was no anger there, no embarrassment, not even urgency. If anything, there was patience. And somehow, that made the silence heavier. A security guard near the revolving door shifted his stance, unsure whether to step in or stay invisible. Two junior analysts standing by the elevator exchanged a glance but quickly looked away, their reflections betraying the curiosity they tried to hide. The building itself seemed to hum around them. The low vibration of HVAC systems, the distant chime of an elevator arriving, the muted rhythm of heels against marble somewhere down the hall, but none of it broke the stillness gathering at the center of the room. Marcus could feel the faint coolness of the floor through the sole of his shoe, the weight of the moment pressing not on his body, but on the space around him. He didn't bend, didn't wipe it away, didn't acknowledge it at all. Instead, he let it sit there, visible, undeniable, like a mark that belonged more to the moment than to him. Ethan let out a short laugh, the kind meant to fill gaps, but it landed flat, absorbed by the silence instead of breaking it. What? No response, he muttered, quieter now, as if something about the stillness unsettled him in ways he couldn't quite name. Marcus inhaled slowly, the breath measured, controlled, the kind of breath that didn't belong to someone small. And still, he said nothing. The lobby remained frozen, caught between expectation and something else, something deeper, something shifting just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment it would reveal itself. Marcus Reed had learned a long time ago that silence could carry more weight than words, especially in rooms like this where people spoke too quickly and listened too little. He had stood in this very lobby hundreds of times before, always in the same place near the front entrance, always at the edge of conversations that were never meant for him. People walked past him every day with phones pressed to their ears, voices sharp with urgency, never once wondering who he was beyond the uniform he wore. To them, he was part of the routine, like the revolving door or the security desk, something that functioned without question and disappeared the moment it was no longer needed. This morning had started no differently. He had arrived at 6:30 a.m., just as the first lights stretched across the glass exterior of the building, turning the entire structure into a mirror of the waking city. He had parked the car with precision, checked the schedule twice, and waited. Waiting was a skill he had mastered, not with impatience, but with a kind of quiet awareness that most people never developed. He noticed things others missed, like the way the cleaning crew moved in synchronized rhythm before the executives arrived, or how the scent of fresh coffee drifted through the lobby exactly 3 minutes before the first elevator doors opened. He noticed how people changed when they thought no one important was watching. And now, standing here with a faint mark drying on his shoe, he noticed something else. The shift. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there. The way conversations had slowed. The way glances lingered just a fraction longer than they should. The way Ethan Calloway, who had entered this space with effortless dominance, now stood waiting for a reaction that refused to come. Marcus did not look at the boy as someone above or below him. He simply looked at him as he was. Young, unfinished, surrounded by things that had been handed to him so often that he had never learned the weight of earning anything himself. Marcus adjusted his grip behind his back slightly, a small movement that made no sound but grounded him in the moment. The fabric of his jacket was smooth, tailored not for show but for function, every line clean, every detail intentional. Nothing about him was accidental, even if no one here had ever taken the time to notice. Across the lobby, the elevator chimed again, and a group of senior staff stepped out, their voices lowering as they approached, eyes flicking between Ethan and Marcus with quiet calculation. No one spoke. No one intervened. It was not their place, or at least that was what they told themselves. Marcus could feel the faint warmth of sunlight beginning to creep across the marble floor, inching closer to where he stood, catching the edge of his shoe and the mark that still had not been wiped away. He let it remain, not as a statement, not as defiance, but as truth. Some things, once revealed, were not meant to be hidden again. And in that stillness, in that quiet refusal to react, the balance in the room had already begun to change, even if no one had fully realized it yet. Ethan Calloway had never been ignored like this before, not in a room where people usually adjusted their tone the moment he walked in, not in a space where his last name carried more weight than any title on a door. He shifted again, this time more noticeably, his jaw tightening just enough to reveal the first crack in his effortless confidence. The silence around him no longer felt like control. It felt like resistance, subtle but undeniable, like trying to push against something that refused to move. He glanced briefly toward the front desk, expecting someone, anyone, to step in, to restore the familiar order where he spoke, and others responded. But no one did. The receptionist kept her eyes on the screen, though her fingers had stopped moving entirely. The security guard looked straight ahead, posture rigid, as if pretending not to witness what was unfolding just a few feet away. Even the executives who had just stepped off the elevator slowed their pace without stopping, their attention divided between curiosity and caution. Ethan let out a short breath through his nose, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes. He took a step closer, closing the small distance between himself and Marcus, as if proximity alone could re-establish the hierarchy he was used to. "You are still standing there," he said, his voice lower now, edged with something sharper than before, something closer to impatience than amusement. Marcus did not step back. He did not step forward. He simply remained where he was, steady, grounded, his presence unchanged despite the shift in tone. The light from above caught the side of his face, outlining the calm in his expression, the absence of urgency that seemed almost out of place in a moment designed to provoke it. Ethan studied him more closely now, really looking for the first time instead of glancing past him. There was something about the man that did not match the role he had already assigned to him. It was not just the way he stood, though that alone was different. It was the lack of reaction, the absence of the small signs people usually showed when they felt pressure. No nervous adjustment of posture. No forced apology. No attempt to explain or appease. Just stillness, deliberate and unshaken. That unsettled him more than any argument could have. "Do you know who I am?" Ethan asked, the question coming out more as a statement than a genuine inquiry, as if the answer should have already been obvious. Marcus let the words settle in the air before responding, not quickly, not slowly, just at the exact moment when the silence had stretched enough to be felt. "I know what you have been given," he said, his voice even, measured, carrying clearly without being raised. "And I can see what you have not learned yet." The words did not echo, but they landed just as firmly, rippling outward through the stillness that had taken hold of the lobby. A faint shift moved through the onlookers, subtle changes in posture, in attention, as if something had been said that could not be unheard. Ethan blinked once, the expression on his face tightening before he could control it, caught between offense and something less familiar, something closer to uncertainty. For the first time since he had walked into the building, the space no longer felt entirely his. And standing in front of him, in a role he had already dismissed, Marcus Reed remained exactly where he had been from the beginning, unchanged, unmoved, and no longer invisible. Ethan's expression hardened, not into anger, but into something colder, something more calculated, like he was recalibrating in real time, searching for a way to regain control of a moment that had quietly slipped out of his hands. He let out a small, humorless laugh and glanced over his shoulder, making sure there was still an audience, because there always had to be an audience. Power, to him, had never been private. It had to be seen, acknowledged, reinforced. "You talk like you have a choice here," he said, turning back, his voice now carrying just enough volume to draw attention again, to pull the room back into his orbit. "You are a driver. That is it. You open doors. You wait. You follow instructions. That is the job." The words were clean, precise, delivered like a script he had never needed to question. A few feet away, one of the executives slowed his pace even further, his eyes flicking between them with a careful neutrality, as if measuring risk rather than reacting to conflict. Marcus listened without interruption, his posture unchanged, his gaze steady but not confrontational, as if he were allowing Ethan to finish not because he agreed, but because he understood that some lessons revealed themselves only after the speaker had fully committed to their position. The sunlight had moved further now, stretching across the floor in a pale gold band that reached the edge of Marcus's shoe, catching the faint mark that still remained. It had begun to dry, losing its shape, but not its presence. Ethan followed Marcus's gaze for a fraction of a second, noticing the mark again, and something in his expression shifted, a flicker of irritation that this small detail had not been erased yet. "Clean it," he said, sharper now, the command landing flat against the stillness. No movement, no hesitation. Marcus did not bend. Instead, he lifted his eyes back to Ethan, and for the first time, there was something more visible there, not anger, not defiance, but clarity. "You think control comes from what you can make people do," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying without effort, threading through the silence that had once again settled over the lobby. "But real control shows in what you cannot force." The words did not rise in volume, yet they seemed to reach every corner of the room. The receptionist's screen dimmed from inactivity. The security guard shifted his weight again, slower this time, as if careful not to disrupt something that had already begun unfolding beyond anyone's intervention. Ethan's jaw tightened, his fingers curling slightly at his side, not into a fist, but into something restrained, something held back by awareness rather than instinct. He was not used to this, not used to resistance that did not look like rebellion, not used to someone who refused to play the role he had already assigned them. He took a step back this time, subtle, almost unintentional, creating a small distance that had not been there before. The shift was minor, but in a room like this, it mattered. Across the lobby, the elevator doors opened again with a soft chime, and this time, the group that stepped out did not continue walking. They paused, just long enough to take in the scene, just long enough for the balance in the room to tilt a little further. Marcus remained where he was, the light now fully touching his shoes, the mark still visible, no longer something to be hidden, but something that had already said more than any reaction could. And in that quiet, in that refusal to comply with a command that once would have gone unquestioned, the structure of the moment shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a steady, irreversible change that had only just begun. Ethan's patience snapped, not in a loud outburst, but in the tightening of his voice, the way each word began to land with sharper edges than before, controlled but no longer effortless. "You do not seem to understand how this works," he said, taking a step forward again, reclaiming the space he had just given up, his presence pressing in not physically, but socially, the way someone used to authority tries to reassert it when it slips. "I can make one call, and you are gone from this building before the next elevator opens." The statement was not a threat in his mind. It was a fact, something he had seen happen too many times to question. Around them, the air shifted again, tighter now, heavier, as if the room itself recognized the escalation even if no one spoke. A woman near the reception desk lowered her eyes, focusing intently on a document that she had not turned in over 30 seconds. One of the analysts adjusted his tie, a small nervous movement that betrayed the tension he was trying to ignore. No one stepped in. No one interrupted. Because this was the part where power usually made itself clear. Marcus heard every word, not just the sound of them, but the belief behind them. the certainty that authority could be exercised without consequence. He had seen that certainty before, in boardrooms, in negotiations, in quiet decisions made behind closed doors where outcomes were decided long before anyone else entered the room. He did not react the way Ethan expected. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. Instead, he let the statement exist, complete and unchallenged, as if allowing it to reveal its own weight. Then he spoke, not louder, not sharper, but with the same steady clarity that had unsettled the room before. "You can remove a person from a place," Marcus said, his voice calm, measured, carrying just enough to reach everyone without demanding attention. "But you cannot remove what they have built." The words settled into the space like something solid, something that did not need to be repeated to be understood. Ethan blinked again, slower this time, the confidence in his expression faltering just enough to be noticeable if someone was looking closely. And now, people were looking. Not openly, not directly, but enough. The executives by the elevator had stopped completely now. Their conversation paused mid-sentence, their attention no longer divided. Even the security guard's posture had shifted, less rigid, more aware. The balance in the room was no longer subtle. It was moving. Ethan let out a breath, sharper than before, his control slipping not in volume, but in precision. "You are just a driver," he said again. But this time the words sounded less like a fact and more like something he needed to convince himself of. Marcus held his gaze, not challenging, not yielding, simply present. "That is what you see," Marcus replied, his tone unchanged, "not what is." The silence that followed was different now. It was no longer waiting for a reaction. It was waiting for something else, something that had not yet been said but was already beginning to take shape. The sunlight had fully reached Marcus's shoes now, illuminating every detail, the polished leather, the faint mark that remained, and the stillness of a man who had not moved once since the moment began. And in that stillness, in that refusal to be reduced to what was expected, the tension reached its highest point, stretched tight between perception and reality, just before something unseen was about to break it wide open. The room did not erupt. It did not fracture into noise or sudden movement. Instead, it settled into something quieter, heavier, like the moment just before a storm decides whether it will break or pass. Marcus Reed stood exactly where he had been, the light now fully surrounding him, tracing the lines of his posture, the calm in his expression, the absence of urgency that no longer looked passive but deliberate. The faint mark on his shoe had dried completely now, no longer a fresh insult, but a fixed detail, something that had become part of the scene rather than a disruption to it. Ethan Calloway felt it, even if he could not name it. The shift had moved beyond discomfort. It was something deeper, something that pressed against the edges of his certainty. He looked around again, not openly, but enough to notice what had changed. People were no longer pretending not to watch. They were still quiet, still careful, but their attention was no longer divided. It was here, focused, waiting. And for the first time, Ethan was not the one controlling where that attention went. He exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself, to return to something familiar, something structured. His hand moved slightly, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve, a gesture that had always grounded him before. But this time it did not. "This is not complicated," he said, his voice lower now, less certain, as if he were speaking as much to himself as to Marcus. "There are roles. There are levels. People stay in them." The words lingered, but they no longer carried the same weight they had moments ago. Marcus listened, not interrupting, not correcting, just allowing the statement to exist in the open space it had been given. Then, slowly, he shifted his gaze, not away, but slightly upward, toward the glass walls that reflected the skyline beyond. For a brief moment, the city filled his view, towers rising in clean lines, sunlight catching on windows dozens of stories high. It was a view most people admired without thinking. To Marcus, it was something else. Time, effort, decisions layered over years, built piece by piece until they became something others assumed had always been there. He brought his gaze back down, steady again, present. "Levels change," he said quietly, the words simple, almost understated, yet carrying a depth that stretched beyond the moment. "What stays is how you treat people when you think they cannot change anything." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, dense with realization that had not yet fully surfaced but was beginning to take shape. Ethan's expression shifted again, not sharply, but gradually, like something inside him was trying to reconcile two versions of the same moment and finding that they did not align. The confidence he had walked in with had not disappeared, but it no longer fit as easily as it had before. Across the lobby, one of the executives straightened slightly, his posture no longer neutral, but attentive. The receptionist finally moved her hand, not to type, but to rest it gently against the desk, as if anchoring herself to the present. Even the distant sounds of the building seemed quieter now, softened, as if the space itself was listening. Marcus did not move. He did not step forward or back. He simply remained, grounded in a way that did not need validation. And in that stillness, in that quiet refusal to engage on terms defined by someone else, the moment stretched, not breaking, not resolving, but deepening, preparing for something that would not be loud, but would change everything that came after. The moment did not announce itself. It did not arrive with raised voices or sudden movement. It came quietly, almost unnoticed, in the soft chime of the elevator as the doors opened once more. This time, the energy that stepped out was different. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Shoes that had been moving with purpose slowed, then stilled. At the center of the group was Richard Calloway, his presence not loud, not theatrical, but undeniable in the way space seemed to organize itself around him. His suit was simple, tailored with precision, his expression composed, but his eyes sharp, observant, taking in more than most realized. He did not speak immediately. He did not need to. The shift in the room had already begun before he even took a step forward. Ethan noticed him first, relief flashing across his face for a brief second, like reinforcement had finally arrived. "Dad?" he said, the word coming out quicker than intended, carrying with it an expectation that things would return to their usual order. Richard did not respond to the tone. Instead, his gaze moved past Ethan, settling on Marcus. Not a glance, not a dismissal, a recognition. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, and for those paying attention, it changed everything. The executives who had paused near the elevator straightened instinctively, their posture shifting from casual observation to something more formal, more deliberate. One of them stepped slightly aside, not directed, not instructed, but as if making space for something already understood. Ethan followed his father's gaze, confusion beginning to replace certainty. He looked back at Marcus, really looked now, as if trying to reconcile the man in front of him with the reaction unfolding around him. Richard took a step forward, then another, each movement measured, unhurried, until he stood just a few feet from Marcus. The lobby, already quiet, seemed to fall into a deeper stillness, the kind that carried weight rather than emptiness. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Richard inclined his head slightly, not exaggerated, not performative, but unmistakably respectful. "Good morning, Mr. Reed," he said, his voice calm, clear, carrying through the space without force. The words landed with a precision that rippled outward, subtle at first, then undeniable. A shift moved through the room, visible now in the way people adjusted their stance, in the way attention sharpened, in the way the unspoken hierarchy that had defined the last several minutes began to unravel. Ethan blinked, the sound of his own breath suddenly louder in his ears than anything else. "Mr. Reed," he repeated under his breath, the title unfamiliar, out of place, yet impossible to ignore. Marcus met Richard's gaze with the same steady composure he had held from the beginning. No change in posture, no sign of surprise, as if this moment had always been part of the equation. "Good morning, Richard," Marcus replied, his tone even, grounded, not deferential, not elevated, simply equal. The exchange was brief, almost ordinary in its structure, but the impact was anything but. Around them, the room recalibrated. What had once seemed clear now blurred, and what had been invisible began to take form. Ethan's certainty fractured quietly, not in a dramatic collapse, but in the slow realization that the roles he had relied on were not what they seemed. And standing in the center of it all, unchanged from the first moment, Marcus Reed was no longer someone the room could look through, but someone it could not ignore. Ethan did not step back this time because he chose to. He stepped back because something inside him had already shifted, something that no longer allowed him to stand in the same place with the same certainty. The word Mr. had not just changed the way the room looked at Marcus. It had changed the way the room looked at him. He felt it in the air, in the subtle repositioning of bodies, in the way the executives who once deferred to him now stood angled toward Marcus instead. His throat tightened slightly, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar weight of being seen without the shield of assumption. "Dad, what is this?" he asked, his voice lower now, stripped of the casual confidence it had carried before. Richard did not answer immediately. His attention remained on Marcus for a moment longer, as if acknowledging something that did not need explanation, before finally turning his gaze toward his son. There was no anger in his expression, no visible disappointment, just a clarity that made the absence of both feel heavier than either would have. "This," Richard said calmly, "is the man who built everything you think you understand." The words did not rise, did not echo, yet they settled across the room with a finality that left no space for interpretation. Ethan's mind moved quickly, trying to reorganize what he knew, what he had assumed, what he had never questioned. Built everything. The phrase repeated in his head, not fitting, not aligning with the version of reality he had carried for years. He looked at Marcus again, but this time there was no dismissal in his gaze, no casual reduction to a role. There was uncertainty, and behind it, something else beginning to form. Recognition. Marcus did not step forward. He did not claim the moment. He simply remained, the same quiet presence he had been from the beginning, unchanged by the revelation that was now reshaping the room around him. "You have been taught ownership as a title," Marcus said, his voice steady, not directed at the room, not even fully directed at Ethan, but present enough to reach him. "But ownership is responsibility. It is what you carry when no one is watching. It is how you treat people when you believe they cannot change your future." Ethan swallowed, the movement small but visible, his eyes dropping briefly, not in submission, but in the first instinct to process something he could not immediately push aside. The mark on Marcus's shoe caught his attention again, now different, no longer just a detail, but a reflection of a moment he could not undo. He hesitated, just for a second, the kind of hesitation that had never existed in him before. "I did not know," he said, the words coming out slower, less certain, stripped of the confidence that had defined every sentence he had spoken earlier. Marcus met his gaze, not with judgment, not with triumph, but with something quieter, something far more difficult to face. "You were not supposed to know," Marcus replied. "You were supposed to understand." The distinction settled deeper than any accusation could have. Around them, the room remained still, not out of tension now, but out of attention, as if everyone present understood that something more important than authority was being revealed. Ethan straightened slightly, not fully recovering, but no longer resisting what had become clear. The structure he had relied on had not just shifted. It had been incomplete from the beginning. And standing in front of him, unchanged in posture, unchanged in tone, Marcus Reed had not taken anything from him. He had simply shown him what had been there all along. No one spoke after that. Not because they did not have words, but because anything spoken too quickly would have broken something that had finally settled into place. The lobby, once filled with quiet movement and routine indifference, now held a different kind of stillness, one that felt earned rather than imposed. Marcus Reed lowered his gaze for the first time, not in submission, not in retreat, but in acknowledgement of something simple and grounded. Slowly, without urgency, he bent down and reached toward his shoe. The movement was calm, deliberate, the kind of motion that carried meaning without needing explanation. From his pocket, he pulled a folded handkerchief, clean, pressed, something prepared long before this moment ever began. He wiped the surface of the leather gently, not rushing, not reacting, just restoring what had been marked. The faint stain disappeared with a few careful strokes, leaving the shoe as it had been before, polished, intact, unchanged in its purpose. But the moment itself did not disappear with it. Ethan watched, his eyes following the movement, something tightening in his chest as he realized what he was seeing. This was not obedience. This was not correction. Marcus was not cleaning the shoe because he had been told to. He was cleaning it because he chose not to carry what had been placed on him. That difference settled deeper than anything that had been said. Marcus straightened again, placing the handkerchief back into his pocket, his posture returning to its original stillness, as if the entire exchange had been just another moment in a much longer story. The sunlight reflected cleanly now off the leather, no trace of what had been there minutes before, but the room remembered. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, the movement uncertain, no longer guided by instinct or entitlement, but by something new, something slower. "I was wrong," he said quietly, the words not forced, not rehearsed, but unfamiliar enough that they carried a weight of their own. Marcus looked at him, not surprised, not softened, just present. "Being wrong is not the problem," Marcus replied, his voice steady, grounded in something far deeper than the moment itself. "Choosing not to learn from it is." Ethan nodded once, small, almost imperceptible, but real. Around them, the tension that had once defined the space had dissolved into something quieter, something closer to understanding. Richard Calloway stood a few steps away, watching not with approval or correction, but with the kind of stillness that allowed the moment to belong to itself. No announcement followed. No explanation. The executives resumed their movement slowly, conversations picking back up, but softer now, more aware. The receptionist returned to her work, though her posture remained different, more present than before. The building continued, as buildings always do, but something within it had shifted in a way that could not be undone. Marcus turned slightly toward the exit, not leaving in a rush, not lingering for recognition, simply moving forward with the same quiet certainty he had carried from the beginning. As he walked, the light followed him across the marble floor, reflecting not just from the glass and steel around him, but from something less visible, something earned over time, something that did not need to be announced to be understood. And behind him, standing in the space where certainty had once been effortless, Ethan remained still for a moment longer, not frozen, not lost, but changed in a way that would take time to fully understand, the kind of change that did not make noise, but reshaped everything that came after.